There'll be a part 1, then a 20-minute break, and a part 2. But before we start, and this comes with a slight footnote, before we start, I'm going to do a little thing. This isn't on, which is a shame, but I'm going to be reading from Avant-Garde Performance, Live Events and Electronic Technologies by Günter Berghaus. It was in this situation, toward the late 1960s and early 1970s, that postmodernism became a major and then dominant trend in Western art. The complex network of economic, social, and intellectual forces that in the post-war period had allowed a last flourishing of modernist art had undergone a profound transformation. I'm going to be reading from 101 Things to Learn in Art School by Kit White. 41. Porosity, not solidity, now defines our view of the world. 86. Objectivity is largely an illusion. 94. Irony has controlled the stage in contemporary art since the end of modernism. 98. Meaning does not exist in the singular. I'm going to be reading from Society of the Spectacle by Guy Debord. In societies dominated by modern conditions of production, life is presented as an immense accumulation of spectacles. Everything that is directly lived has receded into a representation. I'm going to be reading from Performance, A Critical Introduction by Marvin Carlson. The contemporary terms performance and postmodernism are products of the same cultural environment, and both have been widely and variously employed to characterize a broad spectrum of activities, especially in the arts. I'm going to be reading from Post-Dramatic Theatre by Hans Thies Lehmann. For the theatre of the time span we are concerned with here, roughly 1970s to 1990s, the term postmodern theatre has become established. This can be sorted in many ways. The theatre of deconstruction, multimedia theatre, restoratively traditionalist theatre, theatre of gestures and movement. The difficulty of comprehending such a wide field in terms of epoch is evident in many studies that try to characterize the postmodern theatre since 1970s through a long and impressive list of features. I'm going to be reading from Breaking the Rules, the Wooster Group by David Savran. Among producers of experimental theatre in the 1970s and 1980s, the Wooster Group is unique for its combination of aesthetic and political radicalism with intellectual rigor. From the beginning, its work has been tough, difficult, vigorous, and controversial. The reason why I just did that will become apparent later. So the main things we're going to tackle today are: what on earth is postmodernism? What is the relationship between postmodernism and modernism? What are some of the key philosophical ideas and concepts related to postmodernism? How does postmodernism manifest in the arts, and particularly in theatre? And we will be using the Wooster Group and forced entertainment as examples. The Wooster Group is the main example, and forced entertainment is just like a little extra. So, just looking at the word postmodernist, actually, why don't we have a show of hands? Who has, even if you don't necessarily have a complete understanding of what it entails, but who has ever heard that word, postmodernism? Okay, great. A lot of hands coming up. So this will be perhaps slightly familiar territory, and as I said last week, you guys are very much the product of postmodernism. So just looking at the word postmodernism, you'll notice that the M of modernism there is capitalized, right? It's not modern with a lowercase m in terms of current now, but modernism with an M. What, okay, what is that? We'll have a look at that in a moment. Suggests that it is a movement like naturalism with capital M. So what does the post mean? That's the first thing that I wanted to start with. Does it mean after, chronologically speaking? does it mean against? You will find people that argue that it is very much against. Postmodernism is against modernism. Other people think that it's just a chronological description. So post meaning after, it just comes after modernism, and therefore perhaps it is not a complete rejection of modernism, but rather an exacerbation, an exaggeration of certain key features of modernism. So why is it hard to define? You come across this idea that it's hard to define. For starters, the concept appears in a number of different fields at very different kind of times. So we have postmodernism in architecture. That's the kind of first thing, the first kind of area where it comes up, kind of in the 70s. But then in art, literature, communication, music, philosophy, economy, it kind of starts to prop up in all these different areas at different times. And of course, each of these areas have a slightly different understanding of it. Postmodernism, unlike, say, naturalism, is not a unified doctrine. It is not a movement. It is arguably not even a style. The little word there in between bracket, zeitgeist, if you want to kind of go with the British pronunciation. Does anybody know what that means? Anybody speak German? Zeit, meaning time, and Geist, like in Poltergeist, means ghost or spirit. So zeitgeist is the spirit of the time, is the mood of a particular era. So postmodernism, rather than as a movement, it's better to think about it as this, as a zeitgeist, is what's in the air now. It is also hard to locate in a historical time frame because it's not really clear when it began. Some of these different, areas and fields like art, architecture, etc. It will have kind of started in these at different times. So does it start directly after the Second World War, or in the 1960s, or in the 70s, or in the 80s? Nobody's really entirely sure. It is best described rather than defined, and it can be described as a set of strategic and critical practices that destabilized modernist understandings of concepts such as existence, presence, identity, meaning, the list goes on. Postmodernism, as I said, is not necessarily a break away from modernism, but it could be seen as an extension of that, reworking and exacerbating certain modernist ideals and practices. So then let's kind of slightly step backwards and think about what is modernism. Modernism is a kind of big umbrella kind of term that covers a number of different artistic movements. If you think of all the kind of avant-garde of the early 20th century, they're all modernist. So surrealism, constructivism, all of that are modernist movements. Modernism really starts kind of at the same time as we have the emergence of naturalism at the end of the 19th century. And then it extends, depending on the artistic genre that you're talking about, it extends well into the second half of the 20th century. And of course, there are still people doing modernist art today, even though we arguably live in a postmodernist era or post-postmodernism. So some of the characteristic of this modernism, this big umbrella term, right? So the surrealists were doing their thing, and the constructivists were doing their thing, and the futurists were doing their thing. But all in all, there is a kind of general kind of list of characteristics that they all shared. So for instance, the emphasis on how seeing and perceiving takes place rather than what is being perceived. They're interested in the way of perception, in the way of depicting something rather than the thing itself. Picasso is interested not in this particular flower vase, but in how that flower vase might be painterly represented in a different way. So there is a rethinking of representation. There is a radical experimentation with form. The focus becomes reading and perception itself rather than the content. There's also a blurring between genres and between high and low culture. This starts at the start of the 20th century, with the invention of collage, etc., the use, the appropriation or use of bits of popular culture. I think it was Picasso himself who was the first person to create a collage by cutting up bits of newspaper and sticking them onto paintings, which to us may seem completely normal and something that kids do in an art class, but back then was absolutely revolutionary. There's also an emphasis in modernism of discontinuous narratives in collages from different materials. I already mentioned collages in the visual arts, and discontinued narratives if you, for instance, think of, I don't know, a work of literature such as Ulysses by James Joyce, stories which are told suddenly, in ways that do not adhere to realistic conventions, perhaps. There is a tendency towards self-consciousness in some cases. If you think of that famous painting by Magritte of a pipe that underneath says, "This is not a pipe," right? Because of course it isn't. It's a symbol of a pipe. It's a painting of a pipe, not a pipe itself. So that, for instance, famous surrealist painting shows a degree of self-consciousness of itself as a painting. There's also an exploration of the psychological and the subjective, the whole Freud, Artaud, right, where suddenly people are interested in the depths of the human psyche and the subjectivity, of each person. There's also use of parody and irony. A few other features of modernism, the reason why I have separated these will become apparent in a moment, is that each separate movement, so surrealism, constructivism, etc., theatre of the absurd, each movement endeavored, they were aiming in their own way to depict reality in terms of a singular fundamental truth that developed during the modernist era. So for instance, if you think about the surrealists and their interest in Freud and dreams, and they try to depict reality, existence, the human condition through this particular lens. If you think about, the influence of Marx, that, the influence that Marx may have had on, let's say, Brecht, right? Let's try and depict and explain reality through this particular lens of Marxism, and so on. They also attempted to construct a coherent worldview, right? So this is a world that we can understand. This is a world that, thanks to this big framework, I can understand, I can comprehend, and I'm, in terms of a work of art, it is a cohesive work of art, right? You'll remember last week when I talked about Wilson that even though he used different elements that somehow clashed, on the whole, the stage picture is a unified whole. It kind of makes sense together, right? There's a coherent aesthetic. There's also in modernism, of course, with these different movements that are popping up like mushrooms throughout the early 20th century, there's an emphasis on originality, autonomy, and the authenticity of the artwork. I am the artist, here is my genius, etc. In terms of design, a key modernist characteristic approach is that form follows function, right? If you think about, I don't know, the designs of the Bauhaus, beautiful, sleek steel teapots without any sense of decoration, without any kind of unnecessary detail. Form follows function. How is this ergonomically designed to better, hold it, pour it, etc. There's also a rejection of, therefore, form follows function. There's a rejection of elaborate formal aesthetics in favor of minimalist design. All of these are, kind of characteristics that try to kind of, as I said, define what modernist or the different modernist movements were trying to do. The reason why I've divided them like this is because you'll find that the ones at the top here, these are all characteristics that are continued and extended by postmodernism. So postmodernism, if modernists already had a slight tendency towards self-consciousness, then postmodernism pushes that to the max. The use of parody and irony, again, is the same. Modernists, were already breaking down the barriers in between high and low culture, while postmodernists suddenly engage with not just high and low culture, but everything is at the same level. There is no high and low anymore. Everything is up for grabs. Anything that is in mass media or history, etc., can be, is at the same kind of on the same plane. The characteristics that you'll find here at the bottom, these are the ones that are distinct breaks from, between modernism and postmodernism. These are the things that postmodernism says, well, actually, no. Let's completely throw that out. So let's forget that form has to follow function. Let's forget that we should aim for simplicity and minimalism, and instead, relish in the excesses of decoration, etc. So, for instance, to give you a kind of good sense of what I mean in terms of modernism, here you have a couple of examples of modernist artworks. You have a painting by Picasso, right? As I said, he's not interested in the, vase, grapes. He's not interested in the subject of the still life. He's interested in the way that the still life is being perceived and represented. You then have an example here of a sculpture by somebody called Brancusi. It's called Bird in Flight, right? So modernist approach to representation. Things don't have to be realistically represented, but instead what he's doing here is he's trying to get to the essence of a bird in flight and reduce the essence of a bird in flight to its most effective and efficient expression. And what you have below is a house designed by somebody called Le Corbusier, a French architect, whose approach to architecture was very much form follows function. And in fact, he talked about houses as machines for living. Postmodernism, on the other hand, particularly we're now talking about postmodernism in art, there are, as I said, certain approaches that postmodernism kind of takes on from modernism and kind of explores in a more radical way, such as self-consciousness, parody, irony, fragmentation, the mixing of genres, ambiguity, simultaneity. These are all the things that it continues. But there are others that are distinctly postmodern. So form no longer follows function, or in fact content. There's a celebration of surface rather than depth, right? Rather than like trying to get to the essence of what a bird. Let's forget that. Let's just look at on the surface. What is that? The use of mass media and advertising have a distinct effect on postmodernism, and so that's where surfaces suddenly become the focus rather than the depth of something. There is a rejection for a need for a unified or unifying aesthetic by employing not just collage, but more extreme approaches such as pastiche and bricolage. There is an emphasis on process rather than product, right? I'm not so much necessarily interested in the finished thing, but in the process through which I create it. There's a hybridization of art forms. So it's not just slightly mixing genres, but actually completely hybridizing things. So for instance, you have the rise of Tanztheater, which is dance theater, with the work of Pina Bausch, who unfortunately I have to say is not going to be, is not on the kind of curriculum of the main lectures, but I am going to be, when I talk about, that session in week 23, when we will talk about the presentations and the conference papers that you'll be writing, I'm going to be using Pina Bausch as an example. So I'll kind of create a PowerPoint presentation. So I'll be both giving you advice on giving a presentation, whilst also managing to mention Pina Bausch because I'm a big fan. So hybridization of art forms. There's a complete breakdown of the distinctions between high and low. You have, for instance, Philip Glass, for instance, who we came across last week in the relationship with Robert Wilson. He has done a symphony called Heroes that is actually based on the music of David Bowie. So also the idea of kitsch. There's a wonderful example coming up of that now. So the idea of kitsch is very postmodernism. There is an extreme self-reflexivity, so it's more playful and irreverent. It's kind of more disrespectful than modernism was. Intertextuality, this is a word that'll come up throughout the lecture a couple of times. So the intertextuality is in between texts, right? So when a text makes, or a text or a play or an artwork quotes and references other artworks rather than reality itself. There's also a very subversive, rebel attitude that debunks authority and art institutions. So, for instance, in the work of a lot of visual artists, as we'll see in a couple of weeks when we come to performance art, right? All of that comes, the rise of performance art, from a mistrust of the gallery and the museum as an artistic institution. We are now, just to kind of give you a sense of just how much you are already familiar with postmodernism, we're going to have a look at this.
It's going to be champagne wishes and caviar dreams from now on. Take a look at this. We'll be back to pick you up later. Oh, man.
Watch out for the guy cleaning the horse. Right? Okay, so irony, the idea of referencing or not just reality, but other artworks, etc. Layers, right? Surface, kind of like slightly subversive, a really subversive approach to conventional fairy tales, etc. A good example as well is this particular moment here. I have no clue. I don't remember what film this is quoting. Maybe it's Beverly Hills Cop or something like that, but it's certainly an image, right, with this Sunset Boulevard palm trees that has been used and reused in so many different things that I can't tell you anymore what the original was. That we'll come to later when we look at Baudelaire, which is one of the kind of key people. And Shrek, in fact, Shrek, Family Guy, American Dad, South Park, all of these things that you're really familiar with are extremely, extremely postmodernist. Also, postmodernist is the kind of experience of frustration when you have this little wheel of death or doom doing that thing. Oh, this is actually completely frozen now. Oh, there you go. So looking at some postmodern artworks here, you may recognize can I just maybe lower the lights? Is that going to work? Is that slightly better? Okay, so at the top there, you may recognize this as the Sainsbury wing, at the National Gallery on Trafalgar Square, right? The National Gallery, this beautiful neoclassical building with its Doric columns, etc. And for the extension that was then built onto that, this was created, which, as you can see, quotes quite directly neoclassical styles in these columns over here, but then also has a very kind of almost garage-like entry, right? It's just, very formal or functional there in terms of letting light in, etc. This is a sculpture by Jeff Koons. It's not, although it looks like an inflatable balloon, it's actually made of metal. So in terms of shiny surfaces, right? Quoting from, parodying art. This is kind of an artwork that is playing very much with its own materiality. It looks like one thing, but it's actually made of something else. It looks like just a balloon you might be able to buy at a fair, but it's actually an artwork that costs, a lot of money. And then below there you have a good example of Liechtenstein, who's the guy who used comic books as reference points, etc. This one is not just interesting because it's using very much a comic book aesthetic, but also in the text. Why, Brad, darling? This painting is a masterpiece. My, soon you'll have all of New York clamoring for your work. And this is, of course, a painting in which Lichtenstein is himself commenting about his, commenting on his position within the kind of art world in New York. Another couple of examples here. This skull here is allegedly the most expensive work of art to produce. It's a human skull encrusted entirely with diamonds, and it's called. Does anybody know what it's called? It's called "For the Love of God," which is wonderful as a title, right? I mean, it's such an obscene object, right? Let's encrust this skull completely with diamonds, and then it's called "For the Love of God." It's by Damien Hirst, who famously put the shark in the tank. You have another Jeff Koons sculpture here with Michael Jackson and bubbles. This is a great example of kitsch. You then have a Frank Gehry building that is in Prague. Allegedly, it's inspired by two Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers dancing. That's so form no longer follows function. We can just be completely decorative in architecture. And then you have a good example there of a painting, or rather a work by Rauschenberg, who's an American. You can see there how Picasso's and other modernists' use of collage is pushed to its extreme, in that it's all just one big collage, and of course making reference there to Kennedy, etc. Things that are very much in the news and mass media. However, you shouldn't get caught up in just binary oppositions in terms of how something looks and think, for example, looking at these two sculptures, you may be led to believe that due to its simplicity, etc., the one on your left there, that might be something that is postmodern and it's been produced later, etc., earlier, etc., and that the one on the left, on the right rather, is probably postmodern because it's a collage and it's kind of weird and ironic and can't quite make sense of it. However, they are both modernist pieces. The first one is a sculpture by British sculptor Henry Moore from 1975, and then you have a collage there, one of Duchamp's ready-mades from 1913. We are now going to have a look at a brief video. There was an exhibition at the V&A in between 2011 and 2012 called Postmodernism, Style and Subversion, 1970 to 1990. So we'll have a brief look at that. And I've also posted two other links that you may want to explore in your own time. The first one is a link to Tate, as in Tate Modern, Tate Britain, etc. Their website has a wonderful section on postmodernism that gives examples. There are videos in it as well, so do have a look there. And the other one is a YouTube link to a news reportage of a particular exhibition. I think it's maybe in Australia or New Zealand or America. I'm not sure. It's all Anglo-Saxon to me. So let's have a look at that. You'll see at the beginning of the video, you'll see a demolition of a building, like a housing estate, that many people have heralded as the death of modernism. This was a housing complex called Pruitt Igor or something like that. Pruitt Iger, thank you. Pruitt Iger, not Igor, Iger. Pruitt Igo, which was a big housing estate that was going to house all sorts of families, etc. And then it completely collapsed and failed. The community never settled down, etc. And this is a kind of tale that has repeated itself all throughout the world. You guys are probably, if you live in the UK, familiar with that. The big modernist dream of a utopian idealist society, clean lines, concrete buildings, etc. All of that actually not really working out because the world is perhaps a messier place than we initially thought. So the demolition of that of Pruitt Igo has been heralded as the death of modernism in architecture. That's not Pruitt Igo. I will mention. I'll point it out when it comes up. There it is, yeah.
Postmodernism, yes, I still really don't understand what postmodernism is. I've been told many times, and it's been explained to me many times, and I'm still bewildered. But perhaps that's part of the movement, bewilderment.
Bewilderment is part of the movement.
I don't think I really know too much about what postmodernism actually is. For me, it's primarily an architectural movement.
Postmodernism was a kind of style, and it was a kind of outrageous style at that.
I think we're originals, but it wasn't until I got spoken to by the V&A that I thought about anything that was postmodern.
The way I worked, I described as retrievalism.
The Independent said, do use the word postmodernism because it means absolutely nothing and everything.
I call myself a new futurist for a while. So, yeah, that's the term I would use rather than postmodernist.
Well, I suppose I've had a very postmodernist occurrence. I took acid. Normal things suddenly turned into something extraordinary.
Well, in 1977, punk was just starting to happen, and I thought, why not do tears that actually look like tears, and then got safety pins and beaded around them, like 12 years before Versace.
I had access to the first photocopier that was able to modify and change the look of the image using a photocopier.
And of course, in the 70s and into the 80s, the record cover was this incredibly important, vital kind of medium of visual information. There was the music papers, and occasionally, the Sunday Times colour supplement might just sort of, do something about Andy Warhol in New York, and that would be about it.
You can have a look at that again, just in your own time. We're also going to just have a look at what Mo has to say about postmodernism, now that you've had a sense of what that is like.
I don't get all this eyeball stuff. What are they supposed to represent? Eyeballs?
It's Pomo. Postmodern. Yeah, all right. Weird for the sake of weird.
Oh.
Right. So, whilst Mo will have it that postmodernism is, just weird for the sake of weird, I think it's really important that you guys get to grips with the idea that postmodernism is not just a question of style, but a new relationship, or the effect of a new relationship to the world. So we're going to now have a look at, I won't go through this whole table, you can do that in your own time, but just to pick up a few things and key distinctions in between modernism and postmodernism. So, for instance, in terms of reasoning, right, the modernist approach would be to work from the foundation upwards and make your way through an argument in a linear, logical way, whilst postmodernism acknowledges that there are always multiple factors and multiple levels of reasoning. There are many different entry points into a particular subject. Another modernist kind of attitude in terms of reasoning is that there is a very much a belief in reason and logical thinking, whilst postmodernism acknowledges that reason and logical thinking are in themselves artificial frameworks, and they are contingent on context. That's to say, they depend on context. So your reasonable thinking over here may be different to the reasonable thinking to somebody who lives and has grown up in a completely different part of the world. Where is that? Let's jump to, in terms of science, right, modernism has this, what is referred to as universal optimism, right? We can understand the world, we can make sense of it, we can make it a better place. Pruitt Igor is a good example of that. Whilst postmodernism has this inbuilt realism of limitations, right? We are aware now that perhaps we can't make the world a better place in just one fell swoop. In terms of science as well, modernism has this, objectivity belief that objectivity is achievable, that knowledge of how a system works means that we can predict it. A good example of this may be things in weather, or in fact the stock market, right? The whole late capitalism is based on this idea that we can predict the stock market and we can predict how to, what to do to make more money. But of course, several crashes have already kind of taught us rather painfully that the system is just too complex for us to be able to predict, whether it is the weather or the stock market. In terms of science, you have certain key ideas like the uncertainty principle, which talks about how you have a molecule like an electron. You can only ever determine its position or its speed, but not both at the same time. There's also chaos theory that you may know as a butterfly moves its wings in Rio de Janeiro and causes a hurricane in Texas. The idea that the systems are so interconnected and so complex that we can't really make sense of them and understand them. The body, in terms of modernist attitudes, there is a clear dichotomy, distinction in between the organic and the inorganic, the human and the machine, whilst postmodernism embraces a cyborgian mixing of organic and inorganic. Cyborg, of course, meaning mix in between human and machine. So if you think about implants or the use of cell cultures or the fact that you can now have, breed specific cells to treat the particular ailment in this particular individual, etc. In terms of identity, the modernist attitude was that we had a personality, that we have a center, that there is a center to me as Pablo Pakula, that I have this unified self at the core, whilst the postmodern sense actually kind of throws that out of the window and says that the self is just a series of different, sometimes conflicting fragments. So the myself is not located in this one little inner core, but is precisely played out in these differing versions of myself. A good example of it, to go back to Shrek, is when, I don't know, in the first film, if you remember, when they're walking, him and Donkey are walking down this field, and they start to talk about, why people think that I'm bad, blah blah, and then Shrek says that, I'm like an onion, right? So what's interesting there is that what Shrek doesn't quite realize he's saying is that actually an onion doesn't have a center, right? An onion is just layers. It doesn't have a pip, like for instance, I don't know, a peach, which has a unified center. The onion is just a series of layers. So equally, identity from a postmodern sense of view is just a series of shifting versions of yourself. There is no true you, In terms of media, there is a distinction between modernist, during the modernist time, of course, you have broadcast media, you have the rise of the telephone and things like that. But it really, all in all, the media are still very much centralized. So from one to many, you have one television channel that can broadcast to many, yay, great, but in a postmodern age, you have many to many. So whether that's YouTube or Instagram, etc. The fact that news, you can have a good example in the sense that news programs today will very often, what is it called? User-generated footage, right? All of that. A good example in terms of media, and also in a way I think it serves as a good metaphor for reason, science, etc. is, as a metaphor, modernism could be the encyclopedia, right? We can make sense of the world, we can classify it, etc. We can put it into order. There is an order. Whilst postmodernism says, the metaphor that would be opposite, rather than encyclopedia, would be the World Wide Web. Everything is simultaneously happening all over the place. It's chaotic, it's user-generated, etc. There is really no center or order to it. We're now going to have a look at some key philosophical concepts relating to postmodernism. Some of this maybe I did at one point, I think on the first week, that postmodernism is a bit of a head fuck. This is the kind of head fuck moment. But I hope that don't worry about getting a full grasp of each of these. I don't expect you, certainly when it comes to Derrida, I don't expect you to become experts in Derrida, but hey, at least you will have heard of Derrida, and even if you don't fully understand what he means by différance, you will have a sense of what he means by deconstruction. So let's jump straight in with this gentleman, Jean-François Lyotard, who wrote this very important key report called The Postmodern Condition, a report on knowledge, which was published in 1979. It was very much a diagnostic rather than a manifesto, right? Like you have artists who write a manifesto, I'm going to produce this art, and then they go on and to produce it. This was more like a retrospective diagnosis of elements, ideas, trends in knowledge, science, and technology that he identified. It was commissioned by the government of Quebec initially, but obviously, had this was in a way the first book that really delved into this idea of the postmodern and what that might mean. Lyotard says that the postmodernism is the condition of culture in our advanced capitalist society. So he very much connects the rise of postmodernism with changes in our advanced capitalist society, and the rise of mass media, etc. He says, I define postmodernism as incredulity toward meta-narratives. So postmodernism, in a nutshell, is the end of grand narratives. If you want to take one idea away from this slide and from Lyotard, it's that postmodernism is the end of grand narratives. So what on earth are grand narratives? Well, a meta-narrative, you'll sometimes find it referred to as a meta-narrative or grand narrative. They are dominant ideologies, and these dominant ideologies are founded on the principle that reality can be explained and represented in its totality, and that these meta-narratives are used to unify our understanding of the world, of our position in the world, etc. And they attempt to explain the world through that particular prism or story, right? So for instance, Christianity is a meta-narrative, right? God at the top, Son, all of that. Marxism is a meta-narrative or grand narrative in that it tries to explain the world, how society works, through the particular prism of economics and who has the control over the means of production, etc. Freud, right? The idea of the subconscious is another meta-narrative. This sense that we have a id, superego, ego, and the id, right? You kind of cast your mind back to the lecture on Artaud. And you can, all of these try to, or people have tried to use these or have used these as big stories that somehow help them make sense of the world. And postmodernism is acknowledging that these are just constructs, these are just stories, they are just artificial. There is no total unified truth contained in them. They are just particular viewpoints developed at a particular time. Other characteristics that Lyotard talks about in relation to the postmodern condition are that the industrial production, the proletariat, the workers that Marx was talking about, has been completely moved out of sight in the West and is now all nicely bunched together in the third world. He also identifies that Western societies have turned into consumer cultures, right? We're no longer citizens, we're just consumers. He also identified that each and every aspect of social and cultural life has been integrated into a global capitalist order. So the idea of globalization, everything serves the market and it's a global market. And that mass media play a vital role in late capitalist culture where, the expression of living in an information and media society. Moving on, we're going to now have a look at this.
This is the construct. It's our loading program. We can load anything from clothing to equipment, weapons, training simulations, anything we need.
Right now, we're inside a computer program?
Is it really so hard to believe? Your clothes are different, the plugs in your arms and head are gone. Your hair has changed. Your appearance now is what we call residual self-image. It is the mental projection of your digital self.
This isn't real.
What is real? How will you define real? If you're talking about what you can feel, what you can smell, what you can taste and see, then real is simply electrical signals interpreted by your brain. This is the world that you know. The world as it was at the end of the 20th century. It exists now only as part of a neural interactive simulation that we call the Matrix. You've been living in a dream world, Neo. This is the world as it exists today. Welcome to the desert of the real.
So a couple of things to pull out from that. The idea of construct, this is a construct, we live in a construct, is key. And this line, this last line here in this clip, welcome to the desert of the real. That is a direct quote from a book by this chap, Jean Baudrillard, who's a philosopher as well. He came up with the idea that, he theorized that everything is, the idea of the simulacrum. Simulacrum is singular, simulacra is plural. So we live in a world of simulations. Everything is now a simulation. In a sense, we live in a kind of Disney-fied version of the world. Everything is a model or an image or a copy of the copy of the copy. A simulation, he talks about a simulation or simulacrum when the copy has replaced the original. I mentioned earlier that particular clip with Donkey driving down Sunset Boulevard. What was the original in that? Or, if you think about the overuse or use of, printed T-shirts, when somebody, for instance, may own a T-shirt of, let's say, Che Guevara, who, and they may not have any idea of who Che Guevara was or etc. And who made that T-shirt in the first place anyway, So things have become emptied of their original meaning if they ever had one. A simulation, therefore, he says, a simulation is different from a fiction or a lie in that it not only represents an absence as a presence, the imagery as the real, it also undermines any contrast to the real, absorbing the real in itself. So to break that down a little bit, he's saying that it's not just a lie, it's not just a question of representation of this T-shirt of Che Guevara represents Che Guevara and represents my beliefs in, a leftist ideology, etc. But because it is no longer, a symbol that represents this one thing, it's a simulacrum. It's become emptied of its original meaning, and so it absorbs the real within itself. It somehow is just the surface. It no longer represents Che Guevara or my political leanings. When the copy becomes more real than the real, he talks about that in relation to hyperreality. So hyperreality is where the object has been effaced by the signs of its existence. Effaced meaning they're eroded or erased. So the real object, Che Guevara, as a historical figure, or my political leanings, have completely been erased and have evaporated or dissolved, and instead all you have is just a simulacrum. Good examples of this, of course, are The Matrix and The Truman Show as well. In fact, in The Matrix, early on, when somebody goes to Neo's apartment and asks him for like a microchip or something, and he goes to the shelf and picks up a book that has the center cut out, and that's where he keeps all his like dodgy dealings or whatever. That book that he picks out, if you have a look, it's actually Jean Baudrillard's Simulacra and Simulacrum. So there's a distinct definite reference there. Baudrillard also makes some very provocative statements, such as the Gulf War did not take place. This is Gulf War version 1, the prequel, if you may, to the one that you probably are aware of, where it was Daddy Bush rather than Bush Jr., who was bombing the crap out of Iraq. He said that the Gulf War did not take place because the image of the war, preceded and stood in for the war. We had no sense of the war itself, what that meant, the reality of that situation. We were just consuming images produced by the media that in a way erased any possibility of us actually being able to understand what it was like to be there, etc., etc. Other examples, can somebody tell me what this is? It's a beautiful little village, right? It's been there for years. Or this, that is Canterbury. But what on earth is Flint doing in this particularly new development? What on earth are these leaning, kind of like, what do you call the roofs that are, the eaves, roofs with eaves, or these little balconies, or this mixing of styles, right? This is a really good example of postmodernism in architecture. But the reason why I showed you this and this is that essentially it could be anywhere in the UK, right? It's, a wonderful new development somewhere, probably, I'm guessing, off a motorway, that is pretending to be this nice little village, whatever, community, blah, blah, but it's just a simulacrum. And in a way, we live in this, we live in this environment without having any sense of the original anymore. Another example in terms of the Disneyfication of the world is this. Does anybody recognize this? It's Stratford-upon-Avon, which is kind of like become a Shakespeare theme park. You have the big queues, you have banners, you have performers animating the streets in costume, and of course you can purchase your William Shakespeare action figurine. This is what I refer to as the Disneyfication of the world. Moving on to this other chap, you'll notice that a lot of these people have French names. This is Roland Barthes, who is a key thinker, born in France. If I recommend a particular book by his that you should definitely pick up at some point in your degree, it's Image, Music, Text from 1977. It is a series of articles or short essays from work to text, for instance. And the most important one, or the one that we'll be talking about today, is the one that is called The Death of the Author. There's a quote here from Barthes that says, "The birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author." So the key idea is that meaning is not something definite or fixed, bestowed or put into the text by the author, but is only ever activated in the process of reading. When he talks about reading there, he doesn't just mean physical reading, but also watching a film, watching a piece of theatre, viewing a piece of art on the wall, etc. The meaning of that book, piece of art, film, piece of theatre, is not in the book itself. It's in my reading of it, right? So, lecture is what he talks about. So it's not the author that creates meaning. It's actually you, right? So the author is dead, right? The author, let's acknowledge the death of the author. The text is not a finished artistic product. It's a work of art, of course, but it's not finished, right? Every process of coming into contact with that work of art will potentially generate different readings. You may experience this yourselves if you, I don't know, can somebody give me the name of a book they've recently read, of fiction? Room. Sorry? Room by Emma Johnson. Room? By Emma Johnson, yeah. And when did you read that? About 2-3 weeks ago. Okay, great. If you read Room in your 40s, you will probably have a very different experience of it, right? The meanings contained within that are contingent meaning dependent on context, biography, etc. So what Barthes is arguing, is that the author is dead. Therefore, popular questions for you guys in terms of, art students, etc. Popular questions like, what does it mean? Or what does the author or director want to tell me? Are utterly useless and irrelevant. You already know that I absolutely hate the word message, right? As if things have this one singular message that I have to dig and find. And no, it contains, if anything, many messages, or I may read different messages into it. Meaning is not a matter of authorial intention. It is not, Let's stop worrying about what did the author intend to mean here, etc. But it's, at least Barth is arguing that the reader or audience gives the meaning in the encounter with the book, show, piece of art, etc. So analyzing and interpreting a text, or when I say text, kind of in the broadest sense, you can think of it as work of art, etc. But analyzing or interpreting a work has to always appreciate the plural. Right? Acknowledge that there are many readings, many ideas. Sometimes these may be contradictory, and not narrowed down to one particular meaning. So that's the kind of attitude that Barth is suggesting we all take when it comes to encountering works of art. Now, this is kind of like the headiest kind of stuff. This chap is called, another French guy, called Jacques Derrida. The key terms, and the only kind of two that I'm throwing at you today, are deconstruction and différance. If I had to pick between the two, I would much rather you kind of get to grips with deconstruction than différance. Différance itself is quite slippery. So let's start with deconstruction. So deconstruction is an analytical attitude. It's a way of analyzing something. It's a way of picking something apart. It's a relativist attitude, it says there, because it doesn't take things for granted. It relativizes things. Concepts, a deconstructive attitude will have is that concepts are not given. They don't exist in and of themselves, but they're constructed, right? Think back to the construct simulation in the Matrix, right? That's not, so my concept, this idea is not natural. It doesn't just exist in the world, but it's built, it's made, it's constructed by me. Deconstruction also acknowledges that all signs are invested with power. So all ideas will contain a hierarchical power play, etc. When I don't know whether you talk about gender or religion or whatever, thinking about Marxism, for instance, right? If you deconstruct that, everything is imbued with power and play, everything kind of demonstrates or kind of has embedded within it power struggles and power relationships. And therefore there are always traces of the disavowed workings of ideology in the text. So for instance, implicit contradictions that may not be there in the surface, but if you dig a little bit deeper, you suddenly go, oh, actually this kind of contradicts itself. Or presuppositions, assumptions, etc. If you look at the word as a word, deconstruction, you could kind of understand it as destruct, right? Destroy something. Reconstruct, as in put it back together in a slightly different way. You're therefore deconstructing it. You're destroying something, looking at its constituent parts, and then going, actually, if I put these slightly together in a slightly different way, I can now understand that this text, this work of art, this play has within it contradictions, assumptions, etc., that you may not have realized were there if you just kind of do a simple reading of it. Deconstruction is very much a strategy to challenge the power and authority of a work, or a text, or a play, etc. It seeks to unearth, so dig up, and expose hidden traces, for instance, of exclusion, of repression. There will be a really good, clear example when we come to talk about the Wooster Group, a good example of what they did with, does anybody know Thornton Wilder's Our Town? Great, some hands, yeah. So that will be a kind of good example of, don't want to kind of give it away just yet, so just keep in mind this idea of destroying something, reconstructing something, and exposing hidden assumptions, hidden power struggles, etc. Deconstruction also subverts our confidence in common places. So turns of word, expressions, meanings, concepts, it turns concepts on their head, turns words, concepts, and meanings, turns them on their head, kind of. Let's not assume that this is natural and given, but actually let's deconstruct it and see what is actually going on. Différance is very much related to deconstruction, and it refers particularly to an understanding of language and how language works and how language and signs work. So différance is not quite difference in French. It's spelled differently to différence in French. So he kind of created his own word here, but of course within it already contains the idea of difference. Difference kind of would posit, would argue that nothing expressed in language is natural, and nothing has a natural meaning. Instead, opposing concepts rely and contain one another. For instance, black and white, right? You couldn't have black without white. You couldn't have, a good example in terms of theater is a really important book that was published by somebody called Philip Auslander called Liveness, where he talks about the mediatization of culture, etc. And he actually really interestingly points out that until we had recording technology, there was no sense of liveness. So in the Middle Ages, nobody would have talked about, I went to this beautiful live concert, because everything was live, right? So opposite concepts contain and depend upon one another. Meaning, therefore, is endlessly deferred. It's like pushed, kind of like it kind of slips away. It's kind of pushed forward, and you can never really secure it in a particular way. Another example might be the idea of, even a word like tree, right? That is very much dependent on your understanding of forest, of plant and not animal, of water, green, right? Somehow, even a simpler word as tree contains within it is codependent with all these other concepts. And so the meaning of a thing is always kind of just out of reach. Because, Derrida argues, a sign does not mean something to us because of its original substance and unique identity. Tree doesn't mean tree because it's somehow very tree, there's an essence to this. And this is a clear distinction with modernism, right? Whilst modernists were trying to get to the essence of things, the core of things, postmodernists acknowledge that there isn't such a thing, and if we think we have found one, it is probably just a construct. Each sign brings with it an excess of meaning that must be excluded. Tree and not umbrella, and not animal, and not geranium, and not weed, and not algae, and not white shark. I don't know, right? So the meaning of something is always, you have to exclude things to kind of make sense of something. And that's kind of difference. But as I said, if you want to take something away from this slide and from Derrida, I think is that deconstruction is an analytical approach to picking something apart, and difference is, nothing is natural, nothing is given, concepts co-rely on one another. There's a little clip here of a documentary, which I'll just show you because I think it's a really good example of, just at the very beginning of it, Derrida deconstructs the interview he is in.
You're very well known in the States for deconstruction. Can you talk a little bit about the origin of that idea?
Before responding to this question, I want to make a preliminary remark on the completely artificial character of this situation. I don't know who's going to be watching this, but I want to underline, rather than efface or erase, our surrounding technical conditions, and not feign and not fake a naturality which doesn't exist. I've already, in a way, started, blah, blah.
Consiste en particulier à ne pas naturaliser, à ne pas faire comme si ce qui n'est pas naturel était naturel, comme si ce qui est conditionné par l'histoire, par la technique, par l'institution, par la société, était une donnée naturelle.
So nothing is natural, right? Things are conditioned by history, etc. And what he's doing there, and there is then a voiceover that comes in that kind of spoils it slightly, so we don't exactly know what he's kind of going on to say. But what he's doing there at the beginning is, let me draw the attention to the fact that there's nothing natural about this situation. Here I am, kind of casually reclining on this chair, but there's nothing natural about this. You are there, out of shot, with a camera, etc. Right? This is a constructed, artificial situation, which is kind of a nice, neat little example of his attitude. Okay, so before the break, any questions about postmodernism, the kind of concepts that we've kind of briefly looked at. Anybody has any kind of burning questions? I would strongly recommend that you, the little wheel of doom. What should be coming up now in a moment, hopefully, is a little suggestion of further reading. There is one particular book which I strongly recommend. It's called Postmodernism for Beginners. There you go. It's called Postmodernism for Beginners. It's one of those. It's one of a series of books that is like, Marxism for beginners, etc. And the whole thing is like a kind of pseudo comic book. So there are black and white illustrations and stuff like that, and it's quite a handy. It's very small. It's a really handy. It's a really handy way of getting your head around kind of key philosophical ideas of postmodernism. So it is now 3:16. We are about to have a break, but for the first time in the history of this module, there is going to be interval music provided by none other than a band called Postmodern Jukebox. Do you know them? Oh, there you go. So we're going to have some Postmodern Jukebox in the background as we go into the break. See you in 20 minutes. I never did. I'll pass it on later. Cheers. Please forget about this. I forgot about this. We'll just pass it around once, which makes sense. The second time, right?
Unless they're late. Nobody walked in late, is it?
And we are back live now. So, as a kind of reminder, as a little reminder of where we were at in terms of postmodernism, we're now kind of going to be focusing on postmodernist theatre, and this is what our very own Professor Paul Elaine and Jen Harvey have to say about postmodern theatre. Or postmodernism. They define postmodernism as, I quote, a range of cultural practices and sensibilities that have developed since the 1980s, especially, and that reject some of the apparent certainties or grand narratives of modern paradigms of thought, modern ways of thinking, challenging ideas of coherent identity and universal value and truth as not only impossible, but also duplicitous. It poses that these grand narratives only pretend to represent everyone's interests and actually represent dominant class interests. This is from their Routledge Companion of Theatre and Performance, which is kind of like little dictionary, encyclopedia of various terms relevant to performance and theatre. This is what they have to say about postmodernism, and this is just a kind of small recap about what we were talking about before the break. So, postmodernism in theatre. What are its key characteristics? Well, there is a movement away from text-based theatre, a movement away of theatre as just a physicalization of written drama. There is postmodernist theatre is not concerned with the author's intentions, very much in line with Roland Barthes' The Death of the Author. Of course, there's a use of devising approaches. So all the work that you're doing in terms of devising could be classed as postmodern simply by the fact that you're using devising approaches, perhaps, at least methodologically. You might be considered postmodernist. There is a non-linearity in the composition. It's no longer beginning of the story, middle of the story, end of the story. But things may be in the wrong order or happening simultaneously. There is also an emphasis of the here and now of performance. So no longer in a fictional world, in a fictional place, behind a fourth wall, but in the here and now of the event. There's a hybridization of different performance disciplines, so people may be mixing different styles rather than just sticking to one modernist style. Intertextuality, of course, is really important, so mixing high and low cultural source materials, referencing other artworks, referencing other texts, etc. There is a playful and destabilizing approach to identity. So it's no longer the assumption that me, the actor, becomes this character, etc. Instead, there is this notion of the performer versus the actor, or performing versus acting. They are two kind of slightly distinct approaches. So let's talk about performing. Actually, if we start with acting, right? So in acting, when somebody is acting, the actor is portraying a character. The acting takes place within a fictional framework, so a fictional place in a fictional time. Acting does tend to be text-based. There is a text that I, as an actor, pick up and memorize, etc. There is an emphasis on truthfully conveying emotion. I have to feel what the character is feeling, all of that naturalistic stuff. It's essentially naturalistic. Acting is essentially naturalistic. And it does tend to be director-led. It is the director who kind of directs the actors. Performing, on the other hand, is quite different. It is an expression of postmodernism's interrogation of the idea of the unified subject, right? So it's taking that postmodernist approach of like, oh, so there isn't a unified self, etc., blah, blah. It is also performing, normally, resists psychological characterization. So an actor is no longer becoming a character. A performer is a performer. He may or she may be performing herself or a version of herself or maybe kind of a caricature, whatever, but is no longer psychologically constructed character. There is a playful self-awareness and self-reflexiveness to it. So whether that is a self-awareness of conventions, like I'm a performer on stage and I'm aware that you're an audience looking at me and that I'm on a stage and maybe I'm aware of certain expectations that you have, etc. But also there is a kind of pastiche of mixing different styles. So it may be that one bit I deliver as a very serious pseudo-naturalistic monologue, and then I suddenly jump into something that is much more related or closely related to vaudeville or cabaret or something. I may break into song randomly. Performing frequently prioritizes the actor's role as a scenographic element. So, for instance, last time when we were talking about Wilson, on that slide that said, one of his stage signatures was the use of performers, right? He uses performers as scenic elements, bodies in space. They're no longer really actors in the conventional sense. Performing also very often, although not exclusively, does tend to be performer-led. In devising context, although some companies do have a director, it's not a kind of authoritarian director as we would have had, earlier. And of course, performing brings with it the possibility of autobiographical material. I can be myself or versions of myself, etc. I don't have to disappear behind this character. Another word, another term that I'm going to throw at you slightly. Have you come across post-dramatic theatre? No, I was kind of hoping that maybe it was mentioned in the context of text for theatre, but here it is. So post-dramatic theatre, it's one of the books that I started by reading by Hans Thies Lehmann. It was published in German in 1999 and had its first publication in English in 2006. Like Lyotard's postmodern condition, it's not a manifesto of these are the things. It's a diagnostic text. It's kind of looking at what's happening in the world of theatre and trying to draw out some conclusions from what's there. He uses many different examples, the Wooster Group, Pina Bausch, Forced Entertainment as some of them. So post-dramatic theatre challenges dominant theatre hierarchies which invest authority in the text. So post-dramatic theatre is theatre where the text is no longer the most important thing, right? Is no longer that the director and the company are trying to really get behind, kind of unearth and discover the intentions that Arthur Miller had when writing The Crucible, for instance, or the kind of intentions of the author in Thornton Wilder's Our Town. Instead, it deprioritizes narrative text and drama based in psychologically coherent characters and plots. It foregrounds instead the theatrical aspects of the performance. So in the work of Wilson, it emphasizes design, lighting, etc. over story, plot. In the case of the Wooster Group, it may be things like different acting techniques or multimedia or the quoting of different texts rather than just one particular text. Post-dramatic theatre does tend to have a non-linear structure. It is very often more sensory than rational, right? You may not be able to make sense of it rationally of, oh, this means this. This means that, but rather post-dramatic appeals to your senses. Where am I? So time, space, image, for the experiences they are in their own right, rather than for what they convey narratively. Post-dramatic theatre is often also situated in the here and now of the performance, rather than in a fictional framework. It tends to be self-reflexive and meta-theatrical, right? Theatre that is aware of itself as being theatre, plays within plays, etc., or people on stage acknowledging that they are on stage, stuff like that. It also, therefore, demands that the audience construct meaning, acknowledging their role in the meaning-making process, rather than we have this message, we're putting it on stage, etc. The reason why I am bringing in this notion of post-dramatic theatre, as Paula Lane and Jen Harvey say, quote, what makes the theory of post-dramatic theatre distinctive and most constructive within theatre and performance studies is that it is specifically a theory of theatre practice generated from within theatre. Basically, they're saying there that rather than, and as I read from here earlier, where Hans Thies Lehmann talks about the Turkeys, the problems of using postmodernism or postmodern theatre as a term, because it can be so many things and it's kind of slippery, and in a way postmodernism is, as a term, belongs not just to theatre but to all sorts of disciplines, arts, economics, politics, psychology, architecture. Post-dramatic theatre, in a way, is his answer to postmodernism, right? It's kind of like he's making his own term to define postmodern theatre as post-dramatic. The reason why it's post-dramatic is, well, it's no longer theatre as drama, it's no longer theatre as a dramatic text or a dramatic story, a narrative, or a dramatic character. It's post that. So that's just to kind of give you a sense. At least now I can sleep in peace knowing that you'll go through the rest of your degree, at least having heard about post-dramatic theatre and having heard Hans Thies Lehmann. He is a visiting lecturer at the University of Kent. So if at some point later in your degrees you kind of find out that there's a talk or a seminar with him, I would urge you to go. He's a really lovely, down-to-earth, really generous guy. So, on to the Wooster Group. We're going to see as a little introduction, we're just going to have a look at this little clip where Elizabeth Lecomte, who is the director / dramaturg of the company, talks about her visual landscape. Also, hey, finally, it only did take us God knows how many weeks to get to a woman! Yeah! All these dead white men, finally. Okay, so here is a...
All right.
Okay, so here is Elizabeth Lecomte talking about her personal visual landscape.
So where are we?
Right now,
Yeah, where are we right now?
at the Performing Garage, 33 Wooster Street, New York City.
And what is this place?
This place is our home, this place is our studio, this place is our theater. This place is our office.
And who is we?
The company, the
Which is-
Wooster Group.
And what is the Wooster Group?
It's an ensemble theater.
And what do you do?
Oh, I had to get to the hard ones so fast. What do I do? I move around in a space and arrange it in a way that's pleasing to moi. And I move furniture, I move stage furniture and people around, and I listen to them talk.
Yeah,
I think I'm a director. I think I'm a director, but I'm not sure. I'll get it. Hello?
No, he never usually.
Okay, say it again.
Now, why did you pick View Carré?
Because one of our performers, Scott Shepard, caught me saying something about Tennessee Williams being our greatest playwright, or at least discussing the possibility that he was better than O'Neill. And so Scott, in his inimitable way, said, well, why aren't you doing Tennessee Williams? It didn't feel like the regular Tennessee Williams play. The dark side of it was cut by this other weird thing that I didn't know what it was, but some kind of a farcical thing. I thought, oh, the blending of those two things, that earlier Tennessee Williams, the kind of dark and lyrical voice, next to this kind of raucous, satirical one, I thought was good for us.
Do you start with a visual image when you go in?
I did. I started, but it was a visual image that was from the play before, which is Hamlet. Because all of them for me are like, they're like tales that go through my mind, and the visual is my mind. So the visual is not necessarily a literal picture of, like in naturalistic theater. It's an amalgamation of sort of architectural things that move, that feel like my visual landscape, my personal visual landscape. And then I have to bring the text to it and my visual landscape toward the text.
So just to pull out a couple of things that Lecomte mentions, that I love the way that she kind of actively resists this notion of the director. She's like, oh, maybe I'm a director, but I think it is a very kind of postmodern thing to do in terms of, the director as figure of authority within a company, etc. And she resists that. The Wooster Group is an ensemble from the point of view that it's a group of actors who've been working together for a very long time. So it is an ensemble theater. A couple of other things, obviously, you've seen a bunch of TV screens and projections and cameras on stage, so we have a sense that they use multimedia. There's also the sense that they have these rostra that kind of look half finished, right? It looked a little bit like a rehearsal, but that was actually kind of it probably was a rehearsal, but it's not that, oh, and now we're going to put this beautiful set into this space. It actually, the performances are like that, many of them. Also this idea of already a hint towards their deconstructive attitudes towards playtext. So she's talking there about View Carré, one of Tennessee Williams' later plays. And she's talking there about, there is the kind of characteristic, dark, heavy, kind of tragic tone of a Tennessee Williams, but also there's this other thing kind of running through it, and she's interested in picking that out and seeing what happens. She also clearly works like Wilson does, compositionally, right? It's not about narrative and text and making sense. It's a kind of a visual composition of bodies, of images, of screens in this case as well. And this idea of I bring my visual landscape toward the text, and I also bring the text towards my visual landscape, and that there is a kind of meeting in the middle. A couple of things about the Wooster Group as such. They are very much the offspring of Richard Schechner's performance group. Richard Schechner, I think I've mentioned already, right? He's a key thinker. He'll be mentioned again when it comes to performance art in relation to ritual and stuff like that. He's an academic and director. He started TDR. TDR is one of the key, most important theatre journals in the world. It used to be the Drama Review, and now it's just TDR, and he started that. But in the 60s, he was very much involved in the alternative scene in New York. He was instrumental in bringing Grotowski over to New York for the Theatre Laboratory's first performances there. And Richard Schechner started this ensemble company called the Performance Group. With the Performance Group, they were very influenced by Grotowski. He created something, or Schechner came up with his own term, environmental theatre. Not environmental in terms of being environmentally friendly, but in terms of creating theatre that like Grotowski did, created an environment within which the action took place. So using different arrangements with the audience, having the action surround them, or stuff like that. One of their most famous pieces, one of the most famous performance group pieces, was called Dionysus 69. Have a look at that in your own time. So as the performance group was folding, that group kind of came to an end. There were a group of people from that company, from the performance group, including Elizabeth Lecomte, whose background, I should say, is visual. She was a painter rather than somebody who trained in theatre. So these people kind of decided, hey, let's actually stick together and let's make things. And there's a kind of overlap in between the performance group and the Wooster Group, so it's very much an offspring. It was founded in 1980 officially, although they had been working in parallel, as I say, there since 1975. They work collaboratively, they're an ensemble. Elizabeth Lecomte is somehow in between a director and a dramaturg. She arranges material, but the company members themselves are free to bring things to the table, whether that is like Shepard's suggestion, hey, why don't we do a Tennessee Williams, or particular bits of other texts they're interested in. They do performances that are text-based, not just text-based, but also based on existing plays. However, they use those texts, and their approach is completely different to conventional stagings of plays. A couple of examples, and this list is by no means exhaustive, it's not complete, but one of the earliest performances, called Naiad School from 1978, contained extracts and fragments from T.S. Eliot's The Cocktail Party. In Route 1 and 9, the key source text, the key source play, was Thornton Wilder's Our Town. In LSD, Just the High Points, it was Arthur Miller's The Crucible. In Brace Up, it was Chekhov's Three Sisters. In House Lights, it was Gertrude Stein's Dr. Faustus Lights the Lights, which in itself is a version adaptation of Marlowe's and Goethe's Faust myth. In To You the Birdie, it was Racine's Phèdre. And in Poor Theatre, there wasn't an existing text as such, but instead the source texts were the practice of Grotowski and William Forsythe. More about that later. This is a great example of intertextuality, right? In the sense that they take one key source text, but then crash other texts, other movements, other ideas, other images into that. So in a way, Naiad School is not a production of T.S. Eliot's Cocktail Party. It just contains fragments of it. Route 1 and 9 is not a production of Thornton Wilder's Our Town, but it uses that as its kind of quarry, if you may. So the source texts are open to interrogation. That's what they do, right? They don't just go, oh, Thornton Wilder's Our Town. How lovely a play. Let's put it on. Instead, they are deconstructed, and they're also decentered. You know, they're not necessarily at the center of their performance. It may be that, like in Night at School, the cocktail party is just one of many different texts that make up the production. They are quoted, these source texts are quoted rather than staged in their entirety. And they're obviously juxtaposed and collaged with other texts. When I say texts, there could be fragments from popular culture, media, films, personal recollections and autobiographical stuff. And what you can there see is how the Wooster Group's intertextuality, let's take Thornton Wilder's Our Town, and let's mix it with a bunch of other stuff. Their intertextuality is also deconstructive. In mixing these things, they are deconstructing Thornton Wilder's Our Town, for instance. So to look at an example, let's look at Route 1 and 9. It uses as its source play Thornton Wilder's Our Town, but also the performers were in blackface for the duration of the performance. They also quoted a comedy routine from a minstrel performer. Interestingly, Pigmeat Markham was actually a black actor who would have to put blackface on in order to do, minstrel performances. So they took a comedy routine from that. And also it includes home movies. There's a journey away from New York to New Jersey through the thoroughfare. That's the reference in the title of Route 1 and 9 is a reference to that, as well as 1 and 9, kind of opposing numbers, black and white, etc. And there's also a homemade porn film. As Elaine and Harvey say, quote, Route 1 and 9 disrupted our towns in universalizing fantasy of a white, middle-class, Puritan American idyll by introducing racial and cultural difference, Wilder's play omitted. So Our Town is this, story of a beautiful, idyllic, utopian little town in America and the people who live there, blah, blah. But of course, if you kind of deconstruct it, you realize, hey, wait a second, this is an exclusively white community, etc. And what Route 1 and 9 was doing was deconstructing Our Town to kind of bring to the surface the inherent racism that is inside Our Town. Another example is LSD, Just the High Points, which took as its source play Arthur Miller's The Crucible, but also it had a number of references to writings by the Beat generation, so Jack Kerouac, William Burroughs, Allen Ginsberg, etc. It also included writings and recordings by Dr. Timothy Leary, who was a controversial figure in America in the 60s and 70s because he was an advocate of LSD and very much rejected the idea of higher education and stuff like that. And it includes also a debate between Timothy Leary and Gordon Liddy, who had been involved in the Watergate scandal. What's interesting is that Timothy Leary, after having been in prison and stuff like that, and Gordon Liddy, after also having been in prison and stuff like that, got together and went through America doing a series of talks. Timothy Leary representing or standing in for, kind of the extreme left, and Gordon Liddy being kind of a more conservative. And they kind of like just made money out of this. And the production includes extracts of that. There's also in the production a restaging of a rehearsal. There are, and this is a very, it's really difficult to separate myth from reality, but the myth goes that the company took LSD and did a rehearsal on LSD of Arthur Miller's The Crucible, and that they filmed it, and that this production actually contains a recreation of that rehearsal. In reality, what may have happened is slightly different, as you will see in the documentary about the Wooster Group. But there you go. So, these are some pictures of Vieux Carré, which is one of their latest productions, 2009. to quote Elaine and Harvey, juxtapositions like these, like juxtapositions between different sourced materials, produce new resonances of both sources of material, often working to deconstruct the assumed elitism of the classic text and to expose some of their prejudices about race, gender, and age, for example, on which they rely. So these classical texts, that we put on a pedestal as kind of high expressions of our culture and blah blah. Actually, let's take them down from that pedestal. Let's pick them apart, and let's expose the racism, sexism, etc. that they contain. A press release here from the Wooster Group that is quoted in Aronson's book says, "Our texts stand as an alternative language, theatre language, which redefines the traditional devices of storyline, character, and theme. Each production reflects a continuing refinement of a non-linear, abstract aesthetic, which at once subverts and at once pays homage to modern theatrical realism." There is now, we'll have a quick look at some extracts of Vieux Carré.
Interesting eyes.
Well, what do you mean?
Well, isn't the pupil of the left one a little bit blind?
Yes, I'm afraid of developing a cataract in that eye.
Oh, it's not possible for a kid.
I am 28.
What I meant is, your face is still youthful as your vulnerable nature.
Hi there, I'm Nicholas Casamia, and I'm here with Ari Fleakos, member of the Wooster Group. How is the Wooster Group different from any other group in the world?
The simplest way to explain it is that we are all kind of materials, and it's very democratic. Everybody's fair game as far as those materials, right? You have the performers, we have the things that are at our disposal. We have video, we have microphones, we have music, and the text is a material, and this creates a kind of a fabric or a piece, and it ends up being theater.
Home at night, I remember losses must be accepted and survive.
So what is this play, this late Tennessee Williams play?
The writer is, he's coming out as a writer, and he's coming out as a gay man. He's growing up in this boarding house, and he's surrounded by these various people on the skids. And it's funny and sad. It still has all the elements of theater that we love, and it's thoroughly entertaining. But also through it all, you have the arc of the act of creating something.
In my recollection, it's the Elizabeth by Shadow.
Why this Tennessee Williams play? It's a latter play. It's not one of the early well-known plays. It's not a Glass Menagerie. It's not a Streetcar Named Desire.
Streetcar Named Desire has been done brilliantly. This play hasn't. It's a little bit of a lost child, and it's problematic. There's reasons for that. The problems were appealing to us. Towards the end of his career, Williams wrote a lot. We read a lot of his memoirs and stuff and his writings. And he wrote a lot towards the end of his career about kind of theater as being something that shouldn't be represented. That psychological realism isn't enough.
So just to give you an idea there of how they take their work really seriously. So even though it is highly subversive and kind of has a little bit of a fuck you attitude behind it, they do take things really seriously in terms of researching or the reasonings behind what they do. It's not just randomly put stuff together. So for instance they're interested in Vieux Carré because the play itself is semi-autobiographical. Tennessee Williams himself was gay but hadn't come out, and in a way he's coming out through this particular play, which in itself is kind of kind of echoes his own life in terms of living in this boarding house, etc., with all sorts of weird characters. There is also some director's notes about it here.
Like a regular Tennessee Williams play, the dark side of it was cut by this other weird thing that I didn't know what it was, but some kind of a farcical thing. I thought, oh, the blending of those two things. That earlier Tennessee Williams, the kind lyrical voice next to this kind of raucous, satirical one, I thought was good for us. And took the video monitors and pushed one back, pulled one forward, and made them into 3 kind of pallets. I think of them sort of like, in this piece, I think of them like artists' easels. They're on easels.
Get upstairs, boy. We're going to talk in the morning about your future plans.
I have a few plans for the future, Mrs. Wire.
That situation you better calm down right quick.
A combination of that landscape that I like in my mind with what the play needs. First, the camera's there. And then I realized,
it connects.
Because the photographer is this tiny role.
Yeah.
It just comes in, comes up in one scene and then leaves. But I thought, he's there underneath. He's like the base. In the play, he literally lives under the place where the play takes place.
So these cameras that you see here were part of the performance and they were visible by the audience. What Lecomte was referring to there is that in the play there is a minor character who's a photographer who kind of just comes in and out very briefly, and she took that and actually took that as a starting point to make this highly multimedia piece. So what's also important to note is that the Wooster Group are not just deconstructing plays, but they're also deconstructing realism's attempt to portray the truth through realistic acting. They're very much in touch and aware of naturalistic acting, and many of the people of the company have William Dafoe was one of the kind of really early members, and so they're not just deconstructing plays, they're also deconstructing acting itself. As Elaine and Harvey say here, while acknowledging the power and seduction of naturalism's illusionistic performance, the group's work also challenges its cultural dominance and perceived truth through a number of alienating techniques. For example, showing the actor putting drops in his eyes to simulate tears, and replaying a monologue, first as emotionally charged realism, and the second time accelerated and ridiculous. They're, as I said, engaged in pulling apart not just the plays themselves, but also the acting. There's a really great example of this in Fish Story, which is a performance that they did in 1994. It was in 1993 they had done Brace Up, which was which used Chekhov's The Three Sisters, and this used the same set as Brace Up, but was a much more personal, kind of also autobiographical piece. The actor you're about to see now is Ron Water. He actually died in 1994 of AIDS, like many people did at that time. And what's interesting is that for the production, he appeared. They had made a video of him appearing. I think initially because they were already preparing for the day when he would be too sick to be on stage. And this is a particularly poignant thing if you take into account that he's died, etc. So when you're watching this as an audience member in New York at the Performing Garage, you would be aware of that. You would be aware of, Ron Water is not acting anymore because he's in hospital, kind of about to die, or he has already died. So in a way, you're no longer just looking at this text as a character, but also are aware of the autobiographical implications it has. And this particular section is a lovely example of how they're, just exactly how they're deconstructing realistic acting. That's him on screen. So this TV is on the stage.
away. I have to go.
I have to go. The text, I should say, is from the Three Sisters. It's kind of like an amalgamation of various lines from the Three Sisters.
I think it's time for a cigarette. Would you? Right, thank you.
So he's slipping in and out of character there.
I wish you all the best. The very best. Where's Maria Sergeyevna? Please. I have to hurry. Well, everything comes to an end. And now it's time to say goodbye. The town gave us a sort of farewell lunch. Champagne, the mayor made a speech. And I ate and listened. But my heart was here. I kept thinking of you. I'm gonna miss this place. Probably not. Let's try some glycerin.
Notice how the filter, there was a filter on the image to make it look older, and now they've taken that away to this.
Oh. Yes. You, I was what? Oh, I see. Okay. My wife and my two little girls will stay on for another month or so. If they need any help, you think you could? I think I put too much glycerin in. Oh, yeah, anyway. Good, yes. Put too much in one eye and not in the other. Really? All right. Yeah, here you go. Do you have any Kleenex? Oh.
You can watch the rest of that in your own time. Right, so in terms of their approaches to performance and acting, because the company do both, right? They kind of are both acting sometimes, and then also they're just performing, as in being themselves, etc. Or just not being psychologically constructed characters. There is, as you see, no consistency of emotion or psychology. Like that was a really good example of Ron Water slipping into role and out of role, and this slipping in and out is just as much part of his performance as just kind of, you know, self-awareness, etc. They are very much, or often they're, the best expression I can give you is acting in quotation marks, right? When you're kind of acting in a way that, in this case, very self-aware that you're acting. But we're about to have a look at another. We're going to have a look at another example from North Atlantic. That is a wonderful example of acting in quotation marks. It's highly self-aware. It uses non-matrixed acting or non-matrix performance as well. There is a really seminal, important article written by somebody called Michael Kirby, called. I think the title is on matrixed and non-matrixed acting, and he talks about matrix as being on one extreme of the scale, as in I'm a psychologically constructed character, the actor becomes the character, represents the emotions truthfully, etc. And then on the other hand, non-matrixed, there is no matrix on what's happening, is just purely a task. So in the example of a, I don't know, Wooster Group piece, somebody may just smoke a cigarette, etc. Of course, in the middle, you have all sorts of things, like, for instance, the typical spear carrier in a Shakespeare play, right? They're somehow between non-matrixed, because it's just a task. I'm just a task. But also, I'm kind of a little bit like a character, except that I'm not fully psychologically constructed, because I may not have any lines. So that's what's referred to as matrix and non-matrix acting. So the Wooster Group's approach to acting and performance also sometimes uses things that are just a task. It's just an action. There's no pretense. There's no pretense there, right? He's not pretending to cry. He's not pretending to put glycerin in his eye. He's actually putting glycerin in his eye, and yes, the effect is that it looks like he's crying, but there's no real pretense that he is crying. Just as a kind of little footnote, Michael Kirby, who wrote this article, blah, blah, also worked with the Wooster Group, and actually is one of the actors that you'll see in the clips of LSD. The acting also, of course, it's not that the live presence of the actor is prioritized. It's on a par with technology. Somebody may appear on a screen, on a TV, or on a bigger screen, and that in a way is just as important a presence as the presence of the live actor. It juxtaposes realism with stylization and sometimes even dance and movement, and it's very eclectic. There's no unified style. You have a kind of example there, again, Ron Water, this time with Spalding Gray, kind of almost kind of realistic kind of interview thing, whilst then other pieces like The Emperor Jones went back to using blackface, etc. And the example I wanted to give you of acting between quotation marks is this little moment from North Atlantic with Cade Walk and Spalding Gray.
Did you get us set up for tonight with the stenographers and everybody?
Why, General, I told you I'd take care of everything, didn't I?
That's good. But what about the redhead? What's her name? Is she coming?
Troy Burnett, General. She's hardly a redhead.
All right, come on. It is streaked. There's a hint of copper in it. Is she coming?
Oh, you mean Jane? Why, yes, she's coming every chance she gets.
Oh, stop. Don't tease. Please, is she really that bad? Is she really that loose?
Loose? Why, my goodness, General, you could drive a dump truck down that alley K-turn and not even use the rearview mirror.
So it's filthy as well, of course, which is always a delight in my eyes. So what you have here, interestingly, right? You have almost. It's almost like you would say, oh my God, the director has not done his or her work right. They're acting in very different ways. While Spalding Gray is doing something that is fairly naturalistic, Cade Walk is there, kind of, acting within quotation marks. I am now acting. I am this character. The juxtaposition in between the two is something very, very deliberate. Right. Moving on to this, which is a kind of a couple of good examples. We're just going to have another look at another clip from North Atlantic, where is a really wonderful kind of example of them kind of intertextually quoting a song, but also mixing things. And we'll then move on to Poor Theatre. The jump from 2004 in Poor Theatre to then show you something from 1975 is deliberate as well. Am I now going to be able to exit this? Yes. So this is again Ron Water in North Atlantic.
There was a request from American Theater Magazine. Could we do a piece about Ron, who sing a song? Yes, sir.
So that's them essentially just introducing the clip.
Yeah, that's it. I left my home in Amarillo, Texas. Only a kid of 16. But every now and then, I recall the memory of old Dad and home on the range. I hopped an old freight train up to San Antone. I worked as a rounder for about 10 years, just roaming the range and those wide open plains, that wind whispering in my ear.
The whole cast that is on stage then kind of comes in and joins. This is an example. Remember earlier I mentioned Poor Theatre, which was this show that didn't have a play at the core of it, but instead was looking at the practice and the work of Jerzy Grotowski and William Forsythe. William Forsythe is an American choreographer. And this is an example. This is a kind of in terms of how seriously they can take their intertextuality and stuff, and how seriously they actually quote things. This is an example. This is a little clip of the company rehearsing or in the process of making to a Poor Theatre. And what you see here is a clip. You probably might be familiar from those from some of the clips that we had a look at in the Grotowski lecture.
Apart from rehearsals, the actors come to the theatre each morning to exercise. Inside the building, there's an atmosphere of extreme concentration and preparation, something of the atmosphere of a monastery. The exercises are led by different members of the company.
For watching the video.
So as part of the performance making process, they actually kind of copied bits that they saw in the video, etc. In the performance itself, which incidentally I did happen to see in New York, there is a whole section which is particularly funny, where they went to Wrocław in Poland as part of their research to make the piece. And they were told that they could go into the room where Grotowski had worked with his actors, but they couldn't film anything. So instead, they recorded the audio. They make a joke about, oh, haha, Poor Theatre, look at this beautiful wooden floor. If we wish we had this in New York ourselves, etc. And so in the production itself, what you had is a moment where you had overhead a projection of a wooden floor, and then the actors wearing earpieces were listening to the original recording they had made of themselves in that room. And so they walk around the stage and pause and kind of recreate that moment. The most impressive part of Poor Theatre, the production by the Wooster Group, was the end, which completely and utterly mimicked the end of Grotowski's production of Acropolis. And here is a little bit of it. What you saw there in the background, what you saw here in the background, that's the original footage of Acropolis with Zygmunt Molik in this particular role. What they recreated was that last scene where they do which starts with this monologue by Molik, and then they have the kind of procession with the rag Christ type thing. And remember that in Acropolis they all disappeared into this big box that was in the center, that was kind of like the crematoria. In the production of Poor Theatre by the Wooster Group, they disappeared into a similar little hole that was in the rake where the audience were sat. The reason I'm now going to jump to Chaconet Point is to really highlight two things, I guess. One is the indirect connection that, although surprising on the outside, looking at the Wooster Group's work, there is an indirect connection to Grotowski via Richard Schechner and the kind of work that Richard Schechner was doing in the 60s. The other reason why I show you this particular, so in a way, Towards a Poor Theatre, the production was self-aware and acknowledging the Wooster Group's own origins in many ways. And this particular bit from Chaconet Point, I think is a lovely echo of what we just saw, although in a very different way. The person you're going to see in this clip is Spalding Gray. Oh no, this is not the clip, damn it. Okay, so this is a different clip that I want. This is a good example of what I mean by, Schechner's environmental theater and, Grotowski's ideas of mixing the audience with the performers, etc. This is and the importance of song as well, perhaps. So this is just a kind of good example of that. I'll show you Spalding Gray in a moment. So as you can see, during the performance, they're actually kind of altering the space and adding these little curtains. And Wooster Group. The other bit I wanted to show you is, here you go, Spalding Gray. Which I think, is a literal echo almost of, that clip of Moloch doing that, amazing voice work at the end of Acropolis, etc., etc. So can you see the connection there that I'm trying to make? Yeah? Great. Moving on then, what I'm going to show you now, this is a whole article review that was published in the New York Times in 1982. We won't look through the whole thing, but just a couple of things to point out from within this. The link is there, so if you want to look at the article in your own time, you can. But it's Spalding Gray here is talking about how they began making work. We began to structure it. So the company began not with a play, but with improvisations based on objects and images, both brought in by Spalding Gray that had personal associations for him. Spalding Gray then says, we began to structure it like a piece of music, concerned with rhythm, like a painting, concerned with light and color, and like a dance, concerned with movement. Out of this process came Chaconet Point, an almost wordless evocation of childhood and the first of 3 places in Rhode Island. 3 places in Rhode Island was a trilogy of productions by the Wooster Group. The second and the most autobiographical of the Wooster Group's work was Rumstick Road. Using taped conversations with his relatives and his own remembrances, Mr. Gray presented an emotional documentary about his mother, who committed suicide in 1967. The documentary elements appeared alongside choreographed movement and visual images inspired by themes of madness, religion, and medical treatment that surfaced in the story of Spalding Gray's mother. Naiad School, for instance, which Naiad School is, so it was Chaconet Point, Rumstick Road, and then Naiad School. These were the 3 places in Rhode Island. Examines medicine and religion as healing forces. It uses 3 comic horror stories performed as slapstick routines, a scene from T.S. Eliot's The Cocktail Party, with several roles played by children, and some autobiographical vestiges from Rumstick Road. So Naiad School borrowed and reused bits from a previous production. There is then actually, why did I do that? There is then a whole there's a whole lot of clips that I've gone through the kind of trouble of finding them. If you kind of want to have a look at some of them, I guess I might show you this one just for the hell of it. The kind of slapstick horror story, and also the kind of physicality that they were interested in their early work. So mixing this with taped recordings of my mother who committed suicide in 1967. Hey, why not? And it's in these meetings, in these kind of juxtapositions in between different kinds of material. Also notice this red tent, right? That already featured in Shakernet Point, the first part of the trilogy, and then was reused throughout. We're now going to jump slightly to the use of multimedia in the Wooster Group's work. Of course, this is very closely related to the idea of the simulacrum and that everything is simulation. There's a non-hierarchical relationships between the performers and technology, the pre-recorded and live feeds or mics. They often very often use voice alteration, so they alter the voice of the thing. There's a distancing effect, of course. It kind of slightly alienates or highlights the fact that this is a performance, that this is an artificial thing. It also helps with structural fragmentation and presenting conflicting points of view or presenting quoted texts. Here's an example of various productions that have used multimedia. The one that I will highlight, this will. This is again Route 1 and 9. There were little monitors that, in black and white, showed excerpts of dialogue from our town, Thornton Wilder's play, and these were placed above the stage where the blackface performers were kind of, building this house throughout the whole thing. This is a great example, both of intertextuality and multimedia. It's a production they did of Hamlet.
In the Wooster Group's Hamlet, classic tragedy, it's reimagined by remixing and repurposing Richard Burton's 1964 Broadway production, directed by John Gielgud.
But I have to have each little, or else I get.
The Burton production was recorded in the live performance from 17 camera angles and edited into a film.
All right, so take it from just before Horatio, as you guys go out.
My lord, will you two help to hasten them? We will, my lord.
So there's this 1964 film, black and white film, that only exists in fragments. The full original footage, kind of became eroded over time, and we don't have the full film. So instead, what they did was try to recreate from those extracts what the production kind of might have been like. But of course, acknowledging the fissures and the kind of transitions in between that production they're trying to recreate and the live moment of performance. And this is a good example of that.
Now, what impact will it have on entertainment around the world if reverse theatrical film connects? I think it could be fantastic. Of course, this is very much experimental, this one, and we don't quite know how well it will succeed. Whether people will be interested in seeing it, we think they will, because the demand is already quite considerable. Whether it will become a major thing in the theater, I don't know.
So it's acknowledging that these images are constructs, it's acknowledging the artificiality of it, it pays homage as well as undermining that original Burton production. And there are other examples there. A few of the kind of further characteristics, of course, that relate really closely to postmodernism is that the Wooster Group's work is highly self-referential and self-reflexive, making both reference to the making process of that particular show, you know, the process that led to the show, but also quoting previous productions. Of course, it offers many different readings, often contradictory and ambiguous. So meaning is always multiple and contingent to context, that of the author, just as a reminder there. And theatre is very much exposed as a medium. Its materiality is deconstructed, and the conventions are deconstructed and acknowledged. What I mean by deconstructing its materiality is a good example of that was in that clip of Hamlet, where you have, you know, the screens coming into view, the chair being pulled into place, him having to go to the top of stairs only to kind of then go back and sit down, etc. What about the audience then? Well, they're clearly not silent and distant consumers. You have to do a lot of work in many ways, because you have to make sense of these fragments. You have to put them together associatively. You have to, there is no message here. You know, you have to kind of make sense of what you see. So you're very active. You're going to be very active in the meaning-making process. It fosters plurality, because of course some people may get one thing and other people may get another thing. There has been an accusation that their work requires a super competent spectator, that is to say somebody who's aware of theatre traditions, theatre conventions, etc., have a knowledge of or have some understanding of the different texts they are quoting. And whilst this accusation is difficult to deny, I would also argue, you know, think about Shrek, right? If you don't know what Versace is, you're not going to find Versacery funny in any way. If you don't know any traditional fairy tales or the conventions of Disney films, you're not going to be enjoying it as much. So rather than it requiring a super competent spectator, I would argue that it simply has a multi-layered viewing experience. Depending on your existing knowledge, your experience, etc., you will be viewing it at one level or another. The one thing you should watch in your own time is this documentary of the South Bank. It only is, each section is about 28 minutes long. It shows footage of the particularly at least watch the first half, because it shows footage of Rude 1 and 9 and LSD, and it deals with the controversy of having blackface performers on stage. The company actually had their funding withdrawn from the state of New York, because what people couldn't quite wrap their head around was that here was a performance that on the surface was extremely racist, but at the same time was criticizing the tiny bits of racism we all have within and trying to deconstruct them and bring them to the surface. So have a look at that in your own time. There is also a practical invitation, although from what I gathered, not many people did carry out the practical invitation with Wilson. So here it is, just in case you fancy doing it. In your independent study groups or individually, pick an existing play or a fairy tale that you know well. Consider what other texts you might be able to collage with it. Remember that text here means actual texts. There could be medical texts, it could be a news article, it could be a scientific text, it could be an obituary, whatever. What other texts could you crash into it? Quoted movement or dance, tasks, songs, autobiographical material. Consider what the text will add or highlight or deconstruct in the original source play or story that you picked. And what you may want to do is you may want to, I don't know, let's say Three Little Pigs, and I'm going to deconstruct the Three Little Pigs as deconstruct the Three Little Pigs in relation to the housing crisis, right? Or property development. So I might do that, and I might take an advert from an estate agent, etc. And what I'm suggesting at the bottom there, that as a process of putting together a kind of preliminary structure, you may want to write little bits on post-it notes and then start to kind of collage those post-it notes together and see what happens. It's just an exercise, it's just an invitation. Right, we're running out of time, so we're not really going to be able to go into detail about the forced entertainment. In many ways, this lecture used to be just Postmodernism and the Wooster Group, but I feel it's really important that you guys should know about forced entertainment, because even though they're not entirely an equivalent of the Wooster Group, because they don't take place as their starting point, there are a number of similarities. As a way of a bridge between one and the other, the one thing I wanted to show you is some really, so this is the link to the documentary you should watch, is a footage of a really young...
Like being who I am. Wonder if it's worth it being me. Walking on
footage of a very, very young William Dafoe.
On my mind.
There's a little song I know. Maybe you know it too.
The reason I'm showing this particular clip, and go back to it in your own time, is that this figure, right, the standing figure facing the audience with a mic, is a very forced end kind of aesthetic move as well. But an even better example is this. You know, deliberately crap dancing for the sake of it, or deliberately crap cardboard sets. And over here, of course, you have William Dafoe. Forced entertainment, so I'm just going to kind of skip through these. Guys, stay with me for the last 15 minutes and then we can go home. So forced entertainment started in 1984 in Sheffield in the UK. The company was founded by 6 graduates from Exeter University who've been joined over the years by different people, including a Kent graduate, this one here, the one on the far right there. She came to Kent ages ago. They create performances as a collaborative process. They're an ensemble as well, with Tim Etchells, who is the director, in the same way that Liz Lecomte is the director. He works in a way as an editor. The pieces themselves are actually authored by the whole company, but he's kind of acts as an editor, dramaturg. In the rehearsals are not focused towards a product outcome, but they work with rules within which to play and develop material. The projects kind of range from stage shows to site-specific stuff to online and CDs. As you can see, there's a very eclectic aesthetic as well. There are no playtexts at the center of this. This is purely devised material. Oh, what happened there? So there are a number, I'm just kind of do it like this. So there are a number of postmodern characteristics. So they don't produce a clear-cut meaning, but the audience has to construct their own meaning. The performances are often ambiguous, and contradicting tensions are really apparent in the work. This is particularly the case with their use of humor. Sometimes in a forced entertainment show, you will find yourself laughing your ass off, and laughing, and then suddenly the joke that you're laughing at just continues and carries on, and suddenly you're become painfully aware that maybe this isn't quite so funny, or maybe you're implicated in a kind of dark way in what's happening, and you become aware of your own laughter, and so there are these kind of tensions. It's both funny but also deeply not. Like the Wooster Group as well, the theatre is exposed as a medium. It deconstructs its own, usually hidden materiality and convention. So expect rostra, expect things made out of cardboard, microphones, the whole thing looking and feeling a little bit like a rehearsal. They're obviously also not concerned with presenting a fictional world, but their work, perhaps even more so than the Wooster Group's work, is very much situated in the here and now of performance. There's a wonderful speech in one of their shows where there's an actor who walks topless with a whole bunch of dynamite kind of tied up around his chest, and he walks out to the audience and he says something like, there's a word for people like you, audience. And if it came to a fight, you would probably win, because there's more of you than there is of us. So let's see how things work out. There's an awareness of the show being a show, you being an audience, etc. This idea of liveness, like being live in the moment. The performances are also very sometimes open and may change. The audience is acknowledged in their role as audience. There is this idea of DIY aesthetics, so do it yourself. So, hey, let's grab this stuff and these chairs, and I'll go get some cardboard from around the back, and let's make a show with that. So it's very much a DIY approach. They've also been talked about as in relation to this notion of the poetics of failure. The idea that They may be trying to do something and failing terribly. In one of their shows, one of the performers is pretending to die. And so what they do is they just open a can of spaghetti hoops and like throw it all here. And he's like, and actually what he's saying is like, people don't want to watch this. They want to watch something funny and uplifting. And this is horrible. And, you know, so he fakes his own death there. And this idea of poetics of failure, that there's something really lyrical and beautiful about failure. They're very much performers and not actors. Their performances can be extremely task-based. They also use this acting within quotation marks, no use of emotions, etc. And also lists. They're interested in lists. Tim Etchells talks about lists as the loosest collection of material. Whilst a story needs to have a beginning, middle, and end, conventionally speaking, a list can just be a list. And somehow there is something interesting that starts to happen if I start to say, a number of words or things. Suddenly your minds will begin to make connection and it activates the audience. I recommend that you have a look at least at this video here of how we work or how they work. There's a clip here of that shows, actually I might have a look, we might have a quick look at that one just because it's a good overview of what their performances feel like. So that's just a mix of a number of different shows. This is a clip of Hidden. All these clips that I'm just going to skip through are on the PowerPoint, so have a look. This is a clip of Hidden J, which is a nice little echo of that Ron Water crying thing, because here Richard introduces a song, says it always makes him cry, and then pretends to cry in a clearly kind of unconvincing way. This is a lovely in terms of self-awareness and what theatre conventions. This is a great example. So we'll just.
While you're with us here tonight.
While you're with us here tonight. I would like to ask you. To try. To forget about the world. Outside.
Try not to think about anything outside of this room. Anything at all.
Try to forget about cars.
I think the list is the loosest bag for holding some things together.
The list is the loosest bag to hold things together. Actually, this is Tim Etchells. I got it wrong. It wasn't Tim Etchells who said that. But so there you go. Like a really playful. I would like you to not think about a pink elephant. Right? I mean, so there's a kind of playful awareness of conventions and messing with the audience's mind. This is a really good example of. This show is called Spectacular, and it's deliberately unspectacular. Right? There's just a guy in a deliberately crap. Skeleton outfit who comes on stage, and they're also really good at awkward. They exploit the idea of awkwardness in their work very often. So this kind of awkwardness of like, and then the text he goes on to say is also interesting.
mean, how often do most people think about it? Death. I mean, what, once a week, or and then once every 10 days? I mean, there are probably some sort of cheerful people out there who don't think about it more than once a month. But I have to think about it every day. Well, every day there's a performance, so anyway. I have to go into the theatre. I have to stand outside that dressing room, look at the door, knowing what's waiting for me in there. I have to open that door, I have to go in, I have to reach up, I have to touch it, on the hanger there. And then I have to confront it. I have to stare it in the face. Yeah. And then I have to put it on. And then I have to go out and do the show.
There you go. Nice, self-aware, etc. This is a great example of their use of kitsch. It was a production called The Thrill of It All.
Hello, everybody. Hello, and welcome to our show. Welcome to our show. And it's going to be really great.
Listen. These are deliberate aesthetic choices. They're choosing to make work like this. It's not by accident, and neither is it that they don't know how to do proper theatre. This is a definite attitude that they're taking. I won't show you tomorrow's parties. There is an example here of a little talk that I recommend you have a look at. Tim Etchell's talking about durational performance, because one thing that distinguishes them from, or rather makes them unique, is that as well as doing stage shows, they do durational work. Durational meaning that it takes place over several hours with the understanding that the audience can come and go. These shows are structured around almost like games. So you have 12 a.m. and Awake and Looking Down, which they first did in 1993, but the clip that you have here is from a later production. That is like the game of dressing up. And what you saw earlier with the performers with the signs that said Miss Deaf America or Assassin, it's a game of dressing up. There are two rails on either side, and the performers just change costumes throughout the whole thing. There's music that comes in, and they pick from a variety of signs, and that is the performance. Speak Bitterness is kind of like the game of confessing. So they have this long table. So they have this long table with a bunch of bits of paper that have a whole list of confessions on it, all starting with the plural. So we stole from children, we committed fraud, we went out into the night and whatever, forgot who we are. And this performance just goes on, and it's just this endless list of confessions. Then there is Quizula, which is the game of question and answer. You have two performers wearing deliberately shoddy clown makeup, and they're normally situated around or behind some a little circle of lights. One of the rules are really simple. One of them has a list of questions. The other person has to answer, and the person who's asking the questions can jump around the list. What is it better to be drunk with gin, with rum, or with whiskey? What kind of drunk is better? Where are the dead? Where are the dead? So just questions like that. In 2013, Quizula normally takes place like over 6 hours. I think it's gone up to 8. But in 2013, they did a version that lasted 24 hours. And if you look up this hashtag, you'll find, because the performance was also simultaneously, it was streamed online, so it wasn't just people in the studio watching. There were also people all over the world watching, and the Twitter hashtag became like a secondary audience, and there was a lot of debate and just kind of comments going on there. So have a look at that. This is just Quizula to give you a sense of it.
Do you believe in marriage?
No.
Are you a good person?
Yes.
What are good people?
People who don't believe in marriage.
Do you think this is a room full of good people?
This is like a singles club, yeah. Nobody there is married. It's kind of like a swingers club. Swinging from the chandelier.
Have you been to a swingers club?
Yes, I went to a swingers club in Sheffield once.
And this is almost half an hour that I would invite you to watch. It becomes very addictive. And I think what's happening is that when a question gets asked, your brain immediately either already has an answer and wants to check if the performer is going to answer the same thing as you, or you really don't have an answer and you're curious about what they're going to say. And it just becomes addictive. They worked this in shifts, so one of them would leave, and then the next person would come in for a period of 3 hours, and they did this non-stop for 24 hours. Of course, when they were not on stage, they would go to their hotel and have a bit of a kip, or just backstage. So that's a really good example of their durational work. Another great one is On the Thousand Nights, which is the game of storytelling. The rules again are really simple.
Once upon a time, there was a mouse.
So the rule is everybody's on stage wearing these deliberately crap cardboard crowns, wearing these kind of like pseudo, cape type things, and each person starts the story by saying, "Once upon a time, there was blah, blah, blah." It could be real, it could be fictional, it could be made up on the spot, it could be referencing, once upon a time, there was a man, and he lived in a place called Gotham. And he had this like for the dark. And then at any point, one of the other person on the sat down can say stop. And that story is just stopped and abandoned. And they say, once upon a time, there was a city called Gotham. They can sometimes quote one another or go off on a tangent, etc. Have a look at their work. You can actually see them live. They're coming to the Barbican with this particular show. Having said that, they don't do plays. They're doing Shakespeare. They've done a project called The Complete Works, where over the course of a number of days, they're doing all the plays by Shakespeare. In each play lasts about 35 to 40 minutes. You could book as many of these as you want. You could watch it durationally or just go and watch one. Each play only costs you £3. And the way that they tell the stories of the play is by simply having a performer at a table with a series of objects. There are these shelves which have the objects for the different plays, and then it becomes so this guy called Hamlet and his mother, and it's just a kind of storytelling. If you click on the first link here, you'll hear Tim Etchells talking about the reasoning and the thoughts behind this as a project. It's happening in London from the 1st to the 6th of March, so go and watch it. Here's the bibliography for your preparation. Find the 3 articles, read them, revisit some of the stuff that we haven't seen, and see you in 2 weeks for Performance Art. Thank you very much.